In 1979, an FBI agent walked into a maximum security prison with a tape recorder and a legal pad, and no protocol for what he was about to do. No one had ever systematically interviewed serial killers before. There was no framework, no terminology. The entire field of criminal profiling didn't exist yet. Over the next 4 years, John Douglas and Robert Ressler would sit across from 36 of the most dangerous men alive. And what those killers told them would build a psychological map that catches murderers before they ever strike again. Before 1977, when a serial murder case landed on an FBI agent's desk, there was nothing in the manual. Local police departments would call Quantico begging for help, and the Bureau's answer was essentially, look at the evidence, find the suspect. But what do you do when there is no suspect? When bodies keep appearing and the only pattern is brutality? The FBI's behavioral science unit existed, but it focused on hostage negotiation and police stress, not the psychology of repeat killers. Robert Ressler, a veteran agent and criminology instructor at Quantico, noticed something troubling. Detectives across the country kept asking the same questions. Why does this killer pose the bodies? Why does he take souvenirs? Why does he return to the crime scene? And the FBI had no answers. Neither did psychology. The academic literature on serial murder in the mid-1970s was almost non-existent, scattered case studies, a few psychoanalytic papers, but nothing systematic. No taxonomy, no predictive model. So Ressler pitched an idea to his colleague John Douglas, a young agent with a background in industrial psychology. What if they went directly to the source? What if they sat down with the killers themselves and simply asked them why? The idea was radical, and the Bureau wanted nothing to do with it. In 1978, Ressler and Douglas began what they called the Criminal Personality Research Project. The concept was deceptively simple: travel to prisons across the country and interview convicted sexual murderers using a standardized protocol. But there was no funding, no official mandate. FBI leadership considered it academic indulgence. So Douglas and Ressler hid the project. Whenever the BSU sent them on road trips to teach local police, what the Bureau called road schools, they'd add a detour, find the nearest maximum security prison, request an interview with its most dangerous inmate, sit down with a tape recorder. They partnered with Dr. Ann Burgess, a psychiatric nurse researcher from Boston College, to develop a 57-page interview protocol. It covered everything: childhood environment, adolescent fantasies, the crime itself, the emotional aftermath. This wasn't casual conversation. They were building a data set. Between 1979 and 1983, they conducted in-depth interviews with 36 convicted murderers. And the very first one who agreed to talk, the one who would become their single most valuable source, was a 6'9" former police auxiliary named Edmund Kemper. Douglas has said that walking into Vacaville Medical Facility to meet Ed Kemper was the moment everything changed. Kemper had murdered 10 people, including his own mother. He was 6'9", nearly 300 pounds, with a tested IQ of 145. Most killers they would eventually interview were guarded, evasive. Some were outright hostile. Kemper was none of those things. He was articulate, he was eager, and he was disturbingly self-aware. In their first session, Kemper did something no one expected. He analyzed himself. He walked Douglas through his crimes with the clinical detachment of a researcher presenting findings. He explained how he selected victims, college students hitchhiking near UC Santa Cruz, how he rehearsed the abductions in his mind for weeks beforehand, how he practiced appearing non-threatening, picking up and safely dropping off young women multiple times before he ever harmed anyone. He described what he called the little movies, elaborate fantasies he would play and replay in his head, refining every detail before acting them out. Douglas later wrote that Kemper taught them more in a single afternoon than a year of academic study could have. But the real breakthrough wasn't what Kemper said about himself. It was what he revealed about how a certain type of killer thinks. Kemper described with almost professorial precision the planning behind each murder. He kept his car meticulously clean. He chose abduction sites where he wouldn't be observed. He brought tools. He had disposal plans prepared in advance. He described a killing process that was methodical, controlled, and evolving, each crime more refined than the last. Douglas and Ressler started comparing notes. When they matched Kemper's account against crime scenes they'd studied independently, a pattern crystallized. Some scenes showed this same careful orchestration, the body positioned deliberately, evidence removed, a sense of total control. Other crime scenes were the opposite, frenzied attacks. The body left where it fell. Forensic evidence scattered everywhere. Two different psychological signatures, two fundamentally different types of offender. This became the organized versus disorganized classification, arguably the single most influential framework in the history of criminal profiling. Organized offenders planned their crimes, maintained social competence, followed media coverage of their cases. Disorganized offenders acted on impulse, were often socially isolated, and left chaotic scenes. For the first time ever, an investigator could examine a crime scene and make meaningful inferences about the person who committed it, before they had a single suspect. But here's the thing. Not every killer they interviewed made the process this easy. Ted Bundy was the opposite of Kemper in every way that mattered. Where Kemper offered insights freely, Bundy turned every single interaction into a performance. When Douglas visited Bundy on Florida's death row, Bundy refused to discuss his own crimes. He hadn't officially confessed to most of them. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate his intelligence. He'd offer to analyze other cases. He'd present hypotheticals. If someone were to commit this kind of crime, they might think like this. It was a psychological chess match. Bundy was profiling the profilers, testing their knowledge, probing for what they knew and didn't. Douglas recognized the dynamic immediately. Bundy needed to feel superior, so Douglas let him. He positioned Bundy as the expert, asked him to consult on active investigations. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Bundy began revealing himself through the way he analyzed others. When he described how a hypothetical killer might select a victim, he was describing his own method. When he explained the fantasy escalation cycle, he was mapping his own mind. Every hypothetical was a confession wrapped in the third person. Douglas later said Bundy was the most dangerous interview he ever conducted, not because of physical threat, because of how effortlessly Bundy could hijack the conversation, and almost did. The interviews kept coming. Richard Chase, the so-called vampire of Sacramento, was so disorganized he entered a home simply because the door was unlocked, and later told investigators that a locked door meant you weren't welcome. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, eventually admitted the demon dog story was fabricated. The real motive was a craving for power and public attention. Charles Manson didn't fit any single category. He didn't kill directly but orchestrated others to kill for him. Jerome Brudos kept his victims' shoes as trophies. Monty Rissell was only 19 when he started killing. Each interview added data points. Each killer confirmed, complicated, or expanded the emerging framework. Dr. Ann Burgess converted the raw interview transcripts into quantifiable variables, coding childhood abuse, adolescent bedwetting, animal cruelty, fire setting, fantasy escalation, and dozens of other behavioral markers across all 36 subjects. The resulting dataset was the first of its kind in criminological history. 89% of organized offenders were firstborn sons. 73% had above-average intelligence. Disorganized offenders were significantly more likely to live alone and within walking distance of their crime scenes. Numbers, patterns, predictability. The map was finally taking shape. In 1981, the framework faced its first high-stakes field test. Children were disappearing in Atlanta. Over 2 years, 28 young black boys and men had been murdered, and the city was gripped by terror. The FBI was called in. Douglas built a profile using the behavioral patterns from the interview data. Based on the crime scene evidence, victims from similar neighborhoods, abducted with apparent ease, bodies disposed of in locations showing increasing offender confidence. Douglas concluded the killer was a young black male, probably mid-20s, who drove a vehicle connected to his work. He predicted the offender was socially active in the community and would insert himself into the investigation. He even predicted the killer owned a German Shepherd based on unique animal hair fibers recovered from multiple victims. Atlanta police were openly skeptical. The profile was impossibly specific. Then Wayne Williams was arrested, 23 years old, black male, freelance cameraman who drove a station wagon. He had attended vigils for the victims. He owned a German Shepherd. The profile matched on nearly every data point. Criminal profiling went from academic curiosity to operational law enforcement tool virtually overnight. And Douglas became the most requested consultant in bureau history. But that demand came at a cost no one anticipated. The work was destroying John Douglas from the inside. By 1983, he was managing over 150 active cases simultaneously. He had absorbed the details of thousands of crime scene photographs. He had spent years sitting across from men who described dismemberment with the same emotional register most people use to talk about their commute. In December 1983, while consulting on the Green River Killer case in Seattle, a case that wouldn't be solved for nearly 20 more years, Douglas collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital with viral encephalitis, a severe inflammation of the brain. He fell into a coma. Doctors told his wife he might not survive, and if he did, he might never be the same. He was 38 years old. Douglas spent weeks in intensive care and months in recovery. He lost partial hearing in one ear. He struggled with memory and concentration, the very cognitive tools his entire career depended on. The man who built his reputation by getting inside the minds of killers had nearly been consumed by the darkness he studied. But the framework he and Ressler built didn't need Douglas to keep functioning. By 1983, it had already taken on a life of its own. In 1985, the FBI launched the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, a nationwide database designed to identify behavioral patterns across seemingly unrelated violent crimes. It was the profiling framework turned into infrastructure. Every law enforcement agency in the country could now submit case details and check them against known offender behavioral signatures. The Crime Classification Manual, published in 1992 by Douglas, Ressler, Burgess, and Alan Hartman, codified everything the Interview Project had produced. It classified violent crimes the way the DSM classifies mental disorders, by motive, behavioral indicators, and offender characteristics. It became the standard reference for law enforcement agencies worldwide. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the successor to the original BSU, now trains every new agent using the framework built from those 36 prison conversations. The National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime uses the Organized-Disorganized spectrum as a starting point for every criminal profile generated today. What began as two agents sneaking into prisons on their lunch breaks became the foundational methodology for understanding serial violence in the United States and eventually in over 40 countries. But the most remarkable evolution of their work isn't happening inside FBI offices. It's happening inside algorithms. Today, the Douglas-Ressler framework has been absorbed into computational systems that would have seemed like science fiction in 1979. Geographic profiling software, developed by criminologist Kim Rossmo in the 1990s, uses the behavioral patterns Douglas and Ressler identified to predict where a serial offender likely lives, based on the spatial distribution of their crimes. It has been used in active investigations across more than 40 countries. Machine learning models trained on decades of FBI behavioral data can now analyze crime scene variables and generate probabilistic offender profiles in hours, work that used to take Douglas weeks of immersion. The Los Angeles Police Department's Real-Time Analysis and Critical Response Division uses predictive algorithms that incorporate the Organized-Disorganized framework to flag escalating crime patterns before they reach serial offense thresholds. In the United Kingdom, the National Crime Agency's Behavioral Analysis section uses an updated version of the classification system to assess threats from individuals who haven't yet committed murder, intervening before the first kill. That was always the end game, not catching killers after the damage is done, catching them before they start. And it all traces back to a tape recorder, a legal pad, and 36 conversations that no one in law enforcement had been willing to have. Two FBI agents walked into prisons with no playbook and built one from the minds of the most dangerous people alive. The psychological map they drew from those conversations is still catching killers today, and now it's catching them before they begin. If this changed how you think about criminal profiling, hit subscribe. We go deep on the psychology that shapes our world every single week. And drop a comment, which of those 36 interviews would you want to hear the full story of? I'll make it happen.